thank you all, first of all, for spending your Sunday afternoon here. It's an unusual place for a Sunday afternoon in Toronto, where people usually are outside doing all sorts of bizarre things for me, like running 5 kilometers or doing whatever they do. So I appreciate the fact that you're here. Secondly, before I even say very, very much, I wanted to once again thank Peter. The amount of energy and commitment and devotion that he's expended to make this thing happen is quite remarkable. So Peter, thank you once again. I'm going to apologize first for a variety of reasons. One is that I'm absolutely overwhelmed by what's transpired here for the past 12 hours, active hours. I think it's overwhelming. And on a personal note, I spoke to my wife, who is in Banff, and she asked me, what happened? And I said, I'm not sure. I'm absolutely overwhelmed by the amount of intelligence and ideas and conversation that has taken place here. And then this morning, another part of the equation was added to why I'm overwhelmed, because I found this morning unbelievably emotional. And I asked myself, why do I feel this way? And it was clear that we're talking about human lives. And upon reflection, it's quite incredible that we can move, as it were, from an intellectual, legalistic level to human stories and the narrative about 5 lives, which Erwin Kotler talked about, and then human lives of refugees. And it provoked me to say that, or to think that every one of us really has a very, very interesting narrative to relate regarding our roles as citizens and how we think and how we behave in the context of our lives. And the principle of democracy, of course, is part of our existence, at least in this country. Peter, I think, spoke to most of the speakers at the conference ahead of time, and as has been indicated, he has a persuasive way of, I was going to say, telling you what to say, but at least directing you into an area of thought which is very, very helpful. And when Peter said to me, well, you're going to, I think you should say something. And I said, no, the issue and the topic is beyond me. And I just don't know if I can make myself or find a path, an intelligent path through the topic. And then he said, well, say whatever you want. And so I was thrust into this strange world of trying to find a pathway into a discussion which would be of interest to me about the character and dilemma of contemporary democracy and historical democracy as well. So what I'm going to try to do today is at least take you through this kind of intellectual path that I've charted out for myself. I have no idea whether you people will follow along with me. And one of my friends, they asked me, what do you want to talk about? And I said, well, I think I want to talk about democracy, literacy, the damaged brain and the damaged planet. She said to me, you don't have to say anything more. I understand absolutely what you're talking about. So allow me or indulge me as I take you through the pathway which has led me to the conclusion that we're in trouble. We're in deep trouble, not only as people concerned with democracy, but as people who, I think, at least I'm interested in literacy as well. Trying to find a beginning trying to find a beginning is very, very easy, and other speakers have taken us to the beginning of democracy as it was understood by the Greeks. But of course, what I found fascinating is the statement by Pope Francis, who I think is quite extraordinary in his acumen. And it made me begin to think about language and the role of nouns in conversation, political discourse, and action. And it was very, very interesting to me to pursue this. And as you can see, the Pope said he's allergic to these words being adjectives and adverbs. It's one of the problems of our language, and I want to talk about language very, very shortly. It's one of the difficulties of our language because the proliferation of adjectives and adverbs deflect from a real concern with substance, which is noun-driven. So I started thinking, well, what can we do about an understanding, or my understanding, of the discourse on democracy? So of course, as a former academician, you immediately jump into a literature. Well, let me tell you, you drown. And I said, well, how do I make sense of all of this? How do I organize myself in this discourse that's predominant? And of course, there is the good. People tell you that it's the news is not terrible. The news is good because there are over 60 countries who declare themselves democratic. And after that, you go to what I call the bad. That's very, very common today. And the literature on that is overwhelming, especially flowing from the Americans, who really, really feel that their democracy is in a terrible condition. And you can find substantiation for both the perspective on the good and perspective on the bad in the literature. And then I said to myself, well, what about me, who's confused? We have a noun. So how many adjectives have been associated with democracy? Maybe I can get some clarity about what I want to talk about or think about. So I discovered there were 2,234 adjectives associated with democracy. And if you start listing them, you'll get a headache. You certainly will exhaust yourself. And I think it's to the credit of Peter in terms of thinking through the discussion, or a focus for a discussion here, which is constitutional democracy. And then as I went through my pathway seeking some intelligence in the discussion of democracy, I discovered I'm part of what I want to call not the confused, but the ugly. And the reason why I want to look at that more carefully is this wonderful, wonderful double statement, which you can read. The current explosion of digital technology not only is changing the way we live and communicate, but it is rapidly and profoundly altering our brains. We are training our brains to pay attention to crap. The consequence for all intellectual lives may be deadly. And I want to really focus on that, because I think that there is a way of understanding the crisis of democracy in a slightly different manner than before. But as a Canadian, of course, I said, well, you know, I live in the country and I'm pretty happy and this is a wonderful place to be. So why don't I go back and take a look at a little bit about the discourse on democracy in our country? And as a Canadian, I said, well, there were three really seminal moments, in my opinion, in the discourse on democracy in Canada. The academic reference, of course, is to C.B. Macpherson, who found radical democratic solutions in Western Canada in the 1920s and 30s. And if you don't know the literature, it's well worth looking at. The United Farmers of Alberta and Social Credit, the experiments with plebiscitary democracy and delegate democracy. So when people start talking about PR in this country, I keep thinking, well, let's look at our own experience, which may be very, very helpful in terms of that discourse. The second seminal moment, I should add, of course, that Macpherson's theory of possessive individualism and the conclusion he came to that liberal democracy and the fatal embrace of democracy by capitalism's possessive individualism is a real challenge, and we've heard perspectives on that issue from various speakers already. And then I thought of the second seminal moment, at least in my understanding, of the history and character of the discourse on democracy in Canada. Took place again, started in the 30s, strange time in Canada. We invented the CBC. And we did so because we knew damn well that the Americans were at our doorsteps. They had a conception of influence which was going to poison the possibility of public discourse, which, in my opinion, they've done. So we invented the CBC, and through that process of inventing the CBC, we established foundations for a genuine public discourse of democracy. You may criticize the CBC for a variety of reasons, but we should never forget that the bulwark, the foundation of real journalism was pioneered by, and now it is sustained totally by, the CBC. If you go outside the CBC, there is no real journalism that's being done today. And the 1991 Broadcasting Act is well worth reading, and let me read it out loud. The CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, as the national public broadcaster, should provide radio and television services incorporating a wide range of programming now that informs, enlightens, and entertains. Add to that the process way, because the nature of the digital world has changed the CBC, but the mandate has never been changed or transformed. You may say that they're not living up to what the CBC is about, but I think this is a foundation for Canadian democracy. And there is a very, very interesting sort of secondary literature on where the CBC is now from when it was founded. The third foundation, it seems to me, of the democratic discourse in Canada, which is unique, is, of course, the Charter. And we've heard the discussion of Section 1 of the Canadian Charter. One shouldn't forget that these three foundations are really, really important in terms of the beginning of any discourse of democracy in our country. And what we should do is never lose sight of our profound intelligence in terms of the foundations of this discourse on democracy. Nouns, language. So my second preoccupation was literacy. I think we should all worry about it. We are reinventing the English language, or as I would say, we're corrupting it. We communicate in strange, strange ways now, ways which are partly illiterate. I don't know. I mean, I'll say something about Twitter versus Shakespeare in a minute, but I wanted to delve into the character of literacy. And I would highly recommend to all of you a very, very difficult book by Charles Taylor, and the title of the book is called The Language Animal. Taylor, I think, has always had his finger on the transformation that takes place in the intellectual foundation and the intellectual roots of society. And he's a brilliant, brilliant philosopher. If you don't know him, he knows the literature both in English, French, and German. And Taylor, for many, many years, has waged a kind of private battleground on the issue of two ways of thinking about the world. And Taylor has invented, as it were, I think, a very, very important distinction which affects us all now, which is designative language as opposed to constitutive language. Very, very complex, but very, very interesting argument, because he's really assaulting the nature of inductive reasoning, instrumental language, descriptive language, scientific language, and the language which sits at the base of all behavioralism. His argument about the second form of language is constitutive language, which he says is really the essence of human language, which he discusses as expressive language, provides us with a way to access meaning. It's action-based as opposed to behaviorally based, and it's creative. He doesn't conclude at any point about in his thinking. He doesn't conclude anything other than to say that he is going to spend the rest of his life, and he's in his mid-80s, exploring further the constitutive character of language. Meaning for him is embedded in the constitutive character of language, and our most important concerns, he argues, are morality, the meaning of life, freedom, spirituality, poetry, and music. Without those, we are nothing. We're just behavioral beasts. And so when I started thinking about the nature of literacy and how to understand what's going on in the way in which we think and the way we behave, and the tradition that we are now developing, I thought Taylor's admonition to us would be very, very helpful. Let me see if I can get this. So I started thinking carefully that there is a massive battleground which is taking place in front of our eyes in terms of ourselves as linguistic animals. And the battleground is between designative language and constitutive language. Information, facts, algorithms are taking battle, and in my opinion, they're overwhelming the constitutive character of our own language, which is the creative force of discourse, the centrality of speech, of what Taylor calls the speech event, and the circle of communications, the conversational exchange. And as I try to understand this, I started scratching my head and I said to myself, this reverberates for me. And part of the reason why it reverberates for me is, now I'll make a terrible, terrible confession, which Mr. Seglin extracted from me in the corner yesterday. I do not have an iPhone. I am free of the screen. I breathe, I live, I'm marginally informed, I go to appointments, I converse. I don't feel in any way inferior. And I have more time for conversation, for engaging myself in what Taylor calls the constitutive character of language. Ha ha ha. It's the way I see it. And let me tell you, we're losing the battle. The research, and there's massive research now available, especially in American sociology and American social science, on why the battleground is being lost, or there is victory to be proclaimed by these characters: the Googleization of knowledge, the overwhelming character of Facebook, which diminishes conversation, which destroys any way in which human beings normally relate to each other, Instagram, and I'm absolutely convinced that this is just the beginning. More and more is on the way. The research shows, it's astonishing for me, the research shows that among the age group 8 to 12 in the United States, somewhere around 9.5 hours of their lives, on average, is spent in front of the screen. The research is astonishing. The counter force, of course, is constitutive language, and Taylor says, don't forget the creative character of constitutive language. And to me, the one note of optimism I have is when I look around, and I sometimes hang out at OCAD-U, or I wander through the graffiti parks of Toronto. Younger people find meaning in music, song, and they're trying to reform designative language. And I think there is a possibility, very slight, that indeed the battleground is being extended over a longer period of time. So, designative language. It's the language of business, corporations, government, and stock markets. And young people have twigged on to this. We heard from Odd and yesterday about what they understand about the nature of the world that they inhabit. And I think that there is intelligence in there, but the language is really the key. Possessing a language is to be continuously involved in trying to extend its power of articulation. Google doesn't let you do that. Instagram doesn't do that. In other words, we always sense that there are things we cannot properly say, but we would like to express. That's constitutive language. That's what politics is all about. That's what democratic politics is all about. There's always a feeling that there is something the language does not directly contain, but which the mind, the soul, spurred on by language, must supply, and the drive in turn to couple everything felt by the soul with a sound. So why is Taylor important to me? I mean, where did he take me with this? He gave me a handle on the way in which I can understand how I communicate or how people try to communicate with me. And then I came across this wonderful, wonderful research by Marianne Wolf, who took me into basically neurology. I'm not a neurologist, but I remember when I was a student of philosophy, I was very, very interested in the philosophy of mind. What's happened now is there's no such thing as a field of research or discourse in philosophy on the philosophy of mind. It's all related to the nature of neurology. And what we've done, in a bizarre sense, is we've lived for 5.5 centuries with Gutenberg, the consequence of the Gutenberg Revolution, which gave us reading and writing, didn't give us Facebook. So the battleground now is between the demise of the Gutenberg world, which is books, reading, and what Marianne Wolf calls deep reading, and the digitized world, which is totally, totally superficial. It's there, but be careful. Because in the process of participating in the digitized world of the screen, in the process of participating in the digitized world of the screen, we are changing the circuitry of our brain. We did that in the Gutenberg world. We trained ourselves to be able to read and to write, and that provided the basis for a democratic society, which lasted 5.5 centuries. And my argument is that the Gutenberg world is over. Democracy is now in the hands of the digitized world. And the digitized world is only 2 decades old. I'll let you take a minute to read some of this, which I think is quite extraordinary. Can you see it? The documentation on this argument is there, and it really is a very, very powerful argument. So the conclusion I came to, and the research that is now available, is that what I call the world of the screen has produced a damaged brain. And the damaged brain is effectively a rewired process in our brains. And the explosion of digital technology not only is changing the way we live and communicate, but it is rapidly and profoundly altering our brains. We all know how we live, always, before the screen, with the screen, small iPhone, screens, screens, screens. And the consequence of that now is well researched and well documented. And you all know what they are. If not, just if you know some younger people, really young people, just watch the way they spend their time. Cursory reading as opposed to deep reading, which affects intelligence. Distracted thinking, no one can spend time concentrating on anything. Superficial learning, which is now being embedded in the school system, so there is no deep learning any longer. Full-time engagement. The genius of the screen is it's a full-time job. I don't know how you people do it. It's beyond me that every minute you just pull it out and it's a full-time job. I mean, you don't get paid for it, but what you're doing is you're loading your brain with crap. Information overload. It's too much information. It doesn't work anymore, so we cannot distinguish what is important or what isn't important. As a result, there is fake news, there is hate news, there's no news, there's just babble. Hysteria replaces calmness. The number of people at the university level who are going to get mental health is staggering, and the disposal of pills to be tranquil, to be calm, to be thoughtful is amazing. And finally, of course, it's a new form of addiction. And so far, we don't seem to have invented a pill which can de-screen us, which can rewire or take us back to a different circuitry of the brain. Turning out is not an option. Many of us would consider. I wouldn't advocate any of you live like I do, but let me tell you, it's not a bad experience. There was a person on Steve Paikin, a professor of something or other at the University of Toronto, who publicly declared that he took a vacation from the screen for 1 week, and he felt healthy. It's like people want to go to baths to bathe themselves to get rid of the poison in their body. I think what we should do is try, perhaps, to relieve ourselves of the poison of the circuitry we've developed and see what happens. It's less expensive than going to get therapy. Now, what does this all have to do with democracy? Democracy, especially constitutional democracy, thrived in the 5.5 centuries up until the 21st century. And it's very, very interesting when you look at the number of countries where the sense of democracy or sense, at least democratic systems were expanded, grew from very few to over 60, and whether it'll shrink or not, or whether there is a battleground now in so-called democratic societies about whether whether we can sustain a democratic ethos or not is vibrant. The reality is that the damaged brain is now viral. The damaged brain has taken only 2 centuries, and it's global in character. And so, what's interesting to me is that as we try to think through here the nature of democracy, at the same time, we better start thinking about what we're doing to ourselves and the kind of civilization that we're building. We're building a digital civilization which is global in character. The screen is well on its way to rewiring the circuitry of the human brain, and I would assert that the brain damage is causing a global crisis of democracy. And the real problem for me is that the recognition of the damaged planet is now verified by science, or at least most people believe so. There are, of course, skeptics. There's also growing consensus that science may allow us a solution or a way forward how to heal the damaged brain, and it was wonderful to hear Jane Goodall's optimism that human action can, in fact, take us beyond the damaged planet. Does the global condition of the damaged brain open new doors for a new way of doing politics, which is what David Berlin was trying to suggest? I call it a damaged brain. He calls it a different way of doing politics. And it may very well be that we can constitute a different form of politics consistent with the digital age. And searching for that, I think, can be a very, very interesting enterprise. Or has the rewiring of the circuitry of our brains today cursed democracy beyond repair? I leave that as an open question because I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think that the discourse on democracy must take that up. Fake news will not go away. Bad news will not go away. That's the real challenge for all of us, not only for ourselves in this room, but for everybody from the age of 1 day old to whatever age they grow to, because that's the real challenge that I think constitutional democracy must face today. Now, let me go back to Charles Taylor and the battle between behaviorism and what he calls action. We have developed new ways of affecting, influencing, and perhaps controlling consumer behavior. You heard about the way in which research algorithms can change the profit margins of many, many companies. So what we've done is we effectively know how to transform the marketplace, the consumer marketplace, and affect human behavior, turning us into consumption creatures. And now we also know, and that was only a discovery we've taken into account over the past 3 or 4 years, we also know that the same techniques have been applied to voting behavior. So it's no wonder that you've heard people talk about the challenge of Facebook. Facebook knows everything. Facebook will affect me even if I don't know it. Facebook will have a huge influence on the way I'm going to vote. What we've done is we're quite brilliant as a species, because we've taken our intelligence from one area and we've affected, infected, and we're in the process of transforming voting behavior. Taylor. Politics, I think, is constitutive language. And it's all about action, not about encoding and communicating information and affecting behavior. Political action constitutes deep meaning and shape human experience. And the reading of Taylor is very, very complicated, but absolutely compulsory for anybody who wants to think through what the real character of politics is all about. It takes us back to the origins of who we are as a species. So, is there a Greta Thunberg around for the damaged brain? Be interesting to see if you wanted to try a public campaign about the damaged brain. Can we get people on the street to say, close down Facebook? Now, the Europeans are very, very interesting. They're very far advanced in trying to develop a regulatory basis for how they deal with these monolithic monsters now. And what they've done is they fine Facebook on a regular basis $300 billion, and Mr. Facebook sits down, writes a check, gives it to them, and shuts them up. And they're doing the same thing for Google, and they're trying in a very, very interesting way whether we can challenge the way in which these mechanisms have affected the circuitry of our brain. And really, to me, animals behave, the human species acts. And it seems to me that what we've got to do is recover the language of action. That's why I think the Greta Thunberg and the young people who we had here yesterday are onto something very profound in terms of the way we as human beings do politics. We can behave as much as we want as passive creatures, which is the genius of the digital media, because what they do is they give us something for nothing, but of course they take it back in terms of profit. But action requires commitment, it requires meaning, and it requires a way of rethinking what it is we do. Is there a way out? I don't know. Don't know. We've got to think this through very, very carefully, and that's why I say thank you. But I added, on the basis of what we heard from the two young people here yesterday, is it a way out to get on the streets? Action may very well be a way out where democracy of any form can be redeemed. Thank you.